Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alicia Cieslak, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Gordon Food Service. I'm joined today with four exceptional guests to talk about the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. First, I wanted to quickly thank our partners at Back of House for organizing and sponsoring this event. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. who made this happen. This is much needed relief for the restaurant industry, and a special shout out to Senators Gary Peters and Debbie Stabenow in the great state of Michigan, where Gordon Food Service is headquartered. So to briefly introduce our panelists today, I'll start first with my friend Eric Daly, who quite possibly is the smartest person I know. He's a Harvard-educated lawyer. He's been practicing corporate and mergers and acquisitions law since 2007. But since the COVID pandemic started, he's really become an expert in all things COVID and all the various relief packages and funds that are available. And more recently has been helping restaurant operators through the various application processes, understanding eligibility requirements, et cetera. And so Eric is going to get through all of the technical details of the package so you don't have to. Eric, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Alicia. That's very kind, and thank you for having me. My only concern is that you may need to know more people if I miss my but yeah, no, I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, and thanks for Miller Johnson is Eric's law firm based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and offices throughout the state. And so thanks for allowing Eric to join us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ola Williams, who's the head of federal policy at Square. Now, Ola, you're a graduate of Yale, Columbia, and Cornell. And I don't know if you know this, but Eric is a Harvard grad, so we have maybe a little bit of rivalry here. But
it's all good.
You have a really impressive background of working for financial institutions and federal government before coming to Square, where you now drive policy development, legal analysis, and manage external relationships. So I know you know the ins and outs of what's happening on Capitol Hill. So thanks for bringing your insights here today.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. I'm glad to join this panel, and glad you guys thought of Square. We've been working with the SBA and Congress in many ways to try and get this fund and relief program to restaurants, a lot of our small businesses and sellers. So we're very happy to be able to talk about that today.
And then finally, we have Ismini Sakonakis, who's the Director of Integrated Partnerships for Touch Bistro. So Ismini has over 10 years experience in product management, product marketing, and partnership management. She joined Touch Bistro about 2 years ago and has watched the company grow really from a POS provider to a full restaurant management solution. And Ismini also has a background in banking and payment. So one thing about Ismini is she's joining us from Canada. So we officially have an international webinar here this morning. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alicia. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
So this relief fund is so critical right now for the restaurant industry, really ravaged by the COVID pandemic and trying to find its way out of it. We know the restaurant industry is resilient, it's strong, it's scrappy. But one of the things that I think a lot of our operators find challenging is all of these technical requirements for relief funds and other government programs. And so we're really hoping to take some of that complexity out of the equation for you today. And first, I'm going to start with Eric Daly, who will give us a bit of a high-level overview of what this fund really means for the restaurant and the food industry, and how it's different perhaps from some of the things that you've seen earlier on in the pandemic through the CARES Act and the PPP program. So Eric, can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alicia. And you're right, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund is a little bit different than the PPP, which some of our webinar participants today may be familiar with. It's a grant program, unlike the PPP, which is technically a loan program. So if you received a PPP loan, That was originated through a bank. You worked with a lender, and that loan is guaranteed by the federal government, assuming that the bank complied with the program terms and you were eligible. Unlike that program, which had upwards of $900 billion authorized cumulatively over time, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund is smaller. So it's a $28.6 billion program. And unlike the PPP, it is not a loan program. So you're not going to go to your bank. It's a grant program through the SBA. Some businesses who are familiar with the Shuttered Venue Operator grant program that rolled out a month or so ago. This is more akin to that, where you apply directly through the Small Business Administration or potentially through Square, which we can talk about in a little bit. But the key takeaway is you're not applying through a bank and it's not a loan. It's a grant from the federal government. It does still have some limited authorized uses and timeframes for spending the funds. But as a general matter, those parameters are more flexible than the Paycheck Protection Program. So you'll have more time to use these funds than you would if you were a PPP borrower, and you'll have more flexibility in the types of expenses that you can use the funds on. The common elements between the programs at a kind of a high level are that you still need to certify that the funds are necessary to support your ongoing operations. And you still need to retain good documentation of how you actually use the grant funds in case there's an eventual audit by SBA or another government agency. So if you did the PPP, you'll be familiar with some of those types of requirements. I think the same best practices will apply here. If you did not do the PPP, you just want to make sure that you retain good records of what you use the funds for, and you'll have a longer period of time and more flexibility to do that.
Thanks for that, Eric. Now, I know with the PPP program, it really had broad eligibility, and there's been a lot of discussion about certain businesses that are eligible for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, certain ones that are not. And then there's this prioritization period for certain types of businesses. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PPP, when it rolled out originally, more than a year ago now, which is hard to believe, there was really no type of priority set aside, no priority funding group. So you may recall it was just sort of first come, first serve, and you had a lot of large businesses applying, and that made some headlines. So you started to see the pendulum sort of swinging against the PPP, and then back and forth, basically depending on the week or the month, of kind of who should qualify for a PPP and what exactly that need certification really meant. So Congress, in its legislation through the American Rescue Plan, which authorizes the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and the SBA through its rulemaking, have done a few things to put a little more structure in the rollout of the program. One is, as you mentioned, there are 3 priority funding groups. So the application portal opened yesterday, May 3rd, and any eligible applicant for the program, so it doesn't matter if you're in a priority group or not, you're able to start applying for your grant yesterday and get your application started and submitted. However, until May 24th, so for the first 21 days of the program, only applications from the 3 priority groups will be funded. So the 3 priority groups are restaurants and other eligible grant recipients that are owned and operated by some combination of a majority of ownership being women-owned, veteran-owned, or owned by individuals from historically socioeconomically disadvantaged areas or groups. So you can have a combination of those groups to be over 50% to be majority owned, and you need to also be operated by individuals in that category in one of those categories to be eligible for the first priority period of funding through May 24th. And then in addition to that, the priority funding groups, there are set-asides of the overall 28.6 billion. There's a little less than 10 billion, I think, that's been set aside for small businesses, if that makes sense. So revenues, businesses that have revenues below certain thresholds have a portion of that 28.6 billion set aside for funding just those like super small eligible grant recipients, and then slightly larger, and they're tiered thresholds. So, and those set asides will remain in effect, kind of at SBA's discretion, until they get a better sense of the demand in each of those categories. And then starting on May 24th, it's basically going to be whatever applicants came in first will assuming they're eligible, will have their grants funded kind of in the order received of complete applications.
That's a really interesting point. And I think we had that down in the banner below that regardless if you're part of that priority group, it's really critical to get that application complete and in. And as Eric mentioned, that opened yesterday. Okay, great point. Thank you so much, Eric. As we're thinking about the various channels and ways that somebody in a restaurant operation can apply, I wanted to talk to Ola for a second, a little bit about, for those who are customers of SBA approved point of sale vendors, what should they know about the application process?
So the SBA and Square partnered together to streamline the application process. So we provided pre-filled, verified information to send to the SBA as part of the award or grant application. But Square and other what we call ecosystem partners or POS providers are not involved with the actual allocation of the funds. But we're effectively each creating our own application flow that you'll go through with our pre-filled verified data that you can use toward the application that the SBA receives.
That's excellent. I know there are a lot of headlines about how innovative this approach was, and sounds like it'll save operators a lot of time and energy that they don't have. I know labor is a major challenge for operators right now, and owners are doing everything from bussing tables and washing dishes. And so that's a huge help for them.
Yeah, that's a very great point. A lot of the ecosystem partners were working with the SBA to try to create a very innovative process. This is like a one-on-one unique kind of application process that hadn't been done before. And the whole thing was to try to create an application flow, since we had a lot of data for a lot of our restaurant small businesses, to be able to pre-fill that information so that they didn't have to make it such a laborious and manual process like you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Ola, what other information would operators need in addition to what's already been pre-populated from the POS systems? The data entry piece, any supporting documentation. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So small businesses will be able to apply directly through our Square dashboard, and this will have the pre-filled information like I discussed, including owner information, 2019 and 2020 Square revenue, and if they received a loan through Square Capital, it'll have their PPP information as well. But customers will be able to add additional external revenue or PPP loan information if they received it through another lender or bank rather than Square Capital, and then they can add additional owner information.
Excellent.
And we do recommend that that our small businesses come prepared with their external revenue data and PPP loan information and other business details that they can add as additional documents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to switch gears quickly to Ismini. So I know Touch Bistro is not an official POS technology partner in the ecosystem that Ola talked about, but I know you're working with operators to support the application process with SBA. Can you talk a little bit about some of the advantages this process and the support that you provide would be to operators?
Yeah, absolutely. So unlike what Ola explained with Square, with Touch Bistro, it still is the responsibility of the operator to gather all of their information. So nothing has been pre-populated. However, we have trained all of our customer support reps to be able to address any questions that our operators have about the SBA, about any information that they need to gather, what they can get from their accountants and from their lawyers. And I'd say the big advantage for Touch Bistro customers and any other operator that actually is not one of the POS approved operators is that they can still call into the SBA for any questions. So whereas kind of the approved operators, and I don't know too much about this, but will be fielding questions on behalf of the SBA. One of the benefits that we're really highlighting for our customers is also because we're a Canadian-based company, U.S. policy is not something that we necessarily are going to focus on first. So we're actually advising all of our customers to go directly to the SBA, providing them with website information, links, phone numbers, etc., to learn directly from the SBA, and then they can come back to us and we can help them gather any supporting information that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we actually just had a question in the chat, and this was something I wanted to ask, and maybe both for Ismini and Ola. If somebody uses multiple POS systems, or they don't have a POS system at all, or that's integrated through Square, can you talk a little bit about how they might streamline their information collection, application process, et cetera, what they can do if they're maybe less plugged in or it's a less clean solution?
I can start with that one because I think like with Touch Bistro customers where if they've got all their locations with us, or say are their locations with a combination of Touch Bistro and another unintegrated provider, really they've got one application, which is directly with the SBA. And then what I would recommend they do is that they export any relevant reports from all the different POS providers. If they are using kind of like a more traditional legacy system or don't have a POS, your accountant can probably help you gather this information as well. And then you just combine all the information from the different POS providers and submit it into a single application.
Mm-hmm.
So for Square, we're able to support multi-location sellers or small businesses within a single application. But right now, like as of today, maybe not tomorrow, but as of today, we're not able to support multiple locations in the case that a small business has multiple EINs with a Square account. So if a seller falls under that use case, we recommend that they apply with EIN and all associated locations through Square, and then the others through the SBA. So if you have one Square account with an EIN, apply through Square. But if you have multiple EINs, you would have to go. It's best you probably go through the SBA's portal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there other tips, ideas, suggestions, Ola, that you have from your perspective that you can share with operators as they start going through their Square dashboard or otherwise?
Yeah, I would say try to get through it as quickly as possible because, like we said, the funds will run out. We've tried to make our application flow very manageable and a smooth process. We're hoping that we have and we believe that we have the accurate data that's pre-filled and verified. That way, you don't have to add additional documentation. But it is possible that you will have to do that. So at the end of the process, when you're done our application flow, you're able to add certain things like external revenue or additional PPP loan application information that will go along with this application through to the SBA. So just have all your documentation ready.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Now, a question came up in the chat, and I think this is best asked of Eric. So we talked a little bit about the application time window. We talked about the priority groups. We talked about the process, whether you're utilizing some of the integrated technology or not. Eric, could you talk a little bit in more detail about what specific types of businesses qualify and what the funds can be used for?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And the eligibility criteria are pretty broad. So obviously restaurants, but then you've got other categories, things like food trucks, food carts, caterers. You've got brew pubs, and within some of these sort of eligible grant recipients, the SBA has imposed some additional eligibility criteria. For example, for brew pubs or a winery, maybe, for example, they have to show that at least 1/3 of the gross receipts for the business were for sort of on-site consumption of food and drink. So as you get out of the sort of core restaurant, a place where people primarily come to gather to eat and drink, but if you stray a little bit further afield from that, there may be some additional requirements like showing how much of your planned revenue was for those on-site consumption activities. In terms of the eligible uses, you can use the funds pretty broadly. Anything pretty much that you could use a PPP loan for. So you can use it on payroll, you can use it to fund inventory, and you don't need to use it necessarily just going forward either. You can use it to bring yourself current on past amounts due. You can pay rent with it. You can't prepay amounts. For example, prepay debts or rents past the usage period, although the usage period is at least 2 years. It's quite long. So I think most grant recipients will be able to use the funds during that period. But basically, there's a broad array of eligible expenses that you can use them for, including, things you might have invested in as PPE, so personal protective equipment, or construction projects you undertook to create more seating, to socially distance. The SBA does a pretty good job of spelling out on its website and program guide kind of what eligible expenses qualify here. And again, I would just say, make sure you keep records of having spent the funds on those things, even if you've been pretty informal with your bookkeeping in the past. This is a good case where you want to make sure you keep good records.
Thanks for that, Eric. And I know there's some newly opened or newly established restaurants that could also access this program. How can we help those new operators understand if they qualify and what they need to provide to get access to the funds?
Sure. So yeah, this is one of the trickier groups, I would say, as somebody, I've worked with a couple clients who fit into this category where they opened either just at the beginning of 2020, like right before the pandemic, or in some cases were planning to open during the pandemic, still haven't quite opened, but they incurred expenses during that period. And so if your business opened either in 2019 or early 2020, or it incurred eligible expenses early on, really at any point before, I think, March 11th of this year, in anticipation of opening, you still have to plan on opening, relatively soon. You can still apply for the grant. You will apply based on your eligible expenses incurred during a particular period, and you'll subtract from that your revenues and your PPP loan. But it's different than your kind of base or standard case of a business that was operating already in 2018, because it won't be as simple as subtracting your gross receipts in 2020 from your 2019 gross receipts. So there again, it's very important to either get a comfort letter from your accountant about your eligible expenses that go into your grant calculation, if you have the ability to do that quickly. And if not, then I believe the SBA will require either pretty extensive receipts and documentation, or require you as the owner operator who's putting in the application to certify as to the accuracy of your P&L statement or income statement that supports your eligible expenses to calculate the grant. So if you need additional documentation, for example, about purchases of inventory during that relevant period, that could be an area where GFS could for example, probably help you to make sure you've got the records you need to support that, either proactively when you apply or if SBA asks for additional documentation of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Eric. One of the things that I think operators are wondering is, I have maybe some PPP funds, I may get restaurant revitalization funds. How and where do I apply them? What if they're not enough to cover the needs that I have? And maybe this is just open to the group. We'll start with Eric, but any insights you have on that?
Yeah, so the question of PPP and how does this fit in with other programs, I think the most important thing to know is that having received the PPP loan does not necessarily make you ineligible for the grant program.
Mm-hmm.
So you can receive a Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant even if you've already received a PPP loan, or even if you've received both, 2 PPP loans. The proceeds will be subtracted from your grant amount. So, if your grant amount would otherwise be, say, 40,000, and you receive PPP loans worth 50,000, you're not going to get a grant under the revitalization fund. But let's assume that that's not the case, and you still have some additional grant amount to receive. My general feeling is that you'd want to use the PPP funds more for payroll type expenses, because in that program you need to spend at least 60% of your forgiveness amount on payroll, and then try to use the restaurant revitalization funds more flexibly for the other purposes. So at the highest level, that would be kind of the advice that I would give is, and I know it's all fungible, the money's all fungible, but when you go to apply for forgiveness on your PPP loan, you'll want to include mostly payroll cost type expenses, so that then you can use the restaurant revitalization funds for other purposes.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Ismini, Ola, anything from your perspective? Any thoughts there?
No, I think Eric pretty much captured it.
Okay, great. So Ola, talk to me a little bit about some of the questions that you're hearing customers ask about the process, about the technology, about just the program overall, and where do they go if they have questions and they are Square customers?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, there are a decent amount of questions that customers are having right now, and we're working through answering a lot of those. I will say that for questions specific to Square's application, absolutely contact Square, and that's up on our website and on our social media, Twitter, Instagram. But questions that are dealing with the actual fund and are better left for the SBA. And so we direct you to the SBA's website and their social media links. I know it's kind of hard sometimes to tell the difference between the two. So if you are going through the Square option, the ecosystem partner option for application, and you have anything that you're curious about in terms of the application flow, absolutely go to Square, or even questions about pre-filled or verified information that we have up there, go to Square. But once the application has gone through, validated, the SBA has it, and you want to discuss timing, funds, and all of that, you should absolutely go to the SBA, because they'll be the best ones to help you out with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And same question for Ismini. I know you're acting in an advisory capacity, a technology capacity, but what questions are you getting, or what are you hearing, and where do people go for support?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the top 2 questions we're getting is, can you help me apply? So customers do have a lot of questions. A lot of operators have probably applied for the PPP, are looking for any sort of support they can get. So there's a lot of questions around how can my POS provider, whether kind of a pre-approved technology partner or not, help me apply. And then the second question we're getting most frequently is around how funds are allocated and whether or not there's preferential treatment for approved partners. And our response to that, I think Eric has already covered off wonderfully, which is there are priority funds allocated for select groups, but your POS provider does not factor into that calculation.
Mhm. Mhm. Great, thank you for that. I wanted to quick check the chat. So there's a question about determining which calculation method to use. Eric, do you have a sense for how we might answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good question. There are basically three main types of calculations that you might use. The first would be kind of standard base case, your easy case, that I kind of referred to before, where your business has already been operating since 2018, and there you're going to take 2020 revenues, assuming that are lower than your 2019 gross receipts, I should say. That's the SBA term of art here, and subtract your 2020 gross receipts from your 2019 receipts. Then you will back out any loans that you received, right? So they want to make sure that your grant amount is reduced by any PPP loans. And then that'll be your easiest. That's calculation for one. So if you've been operating prior to 2019, that's the one you're going to use. Started operations in 2019, you'll use calculation number two, which calculation number two or calculation number three, depending on which suits you better. You're going to be using calculation number two. Should math on both. Calculation number two will still be a revenue, where you'll take kind of a average of your 2019 revenue gross receipts and use that to calculate your loan amount. And it'll be easier for us to process that because of the reports that partners can provide. Whereas if you use calculation three, which is for businesses, primarily for businesses that 2020 or that have not yet started operations but have incurred expenses, it's going to take a little while to review that because, again, that's not a gross receipts driven calculation. You don't necessarily have the reporting from your POS vendors, and you need to substantiate your expense. So if you've been operating prior to, just to summarize, if you were operating before 2019, calculation one. If you started operations in 2019, you can use either calculation two or three. I'd run the numbers on both. If you didn't know 2020 or you haven't yet started operating, but you incurred eligible expenses before March 1, then you use calculation three. And to complicate things a little bit more, and I think Ola alluded to this before, if you have multiple locations, were operating in 2018 and others didn't open until 2020, there you're going to have sort of a hybrid approach, table 4, I believe, in the application, and that will require most work, documentation and explanation, just because they're going to be calculating your grant amount based on a hybrid approach. You'll use calculation 1 for entities that were open in 2018 and calculation 3 for newly open businesses, probably a more complex and less common case.
Mm-hmm. So I know with the last few programs, specifically PPP, there were a lot of headlines about fraud and misuse and big companies getting access. Can you talk, Eric, a little bit about how this program is different and how SBA is trying to avoid fraud, any sort of audit procedures, things like that? I can imagine an operator might feel frustrated about not being able to access the funds last time, and why would they spend the time to complete the application this time? Maybe you can give them a little bit of faith and trust in the process.
Yeah, so can take that in two parts, and any other panelists who may have this too, I'd be curious to know. But fraud checks and security are more safeguard portals now. So, with the PPP, there was really no requirement. So, for example, the business bank account being funded, the PPP loan was an operating account, for example. And actually, that program was rolled out so quickly from people like me or accountants saying, because these PPP loan funds need to be spent on, it'd be a good idea to set up a separate bank account for your PPP loan. And here it's totally the opposite. The SBA, to validate that the funds are going into an operating account that has at a minimum a 3-month. So like one of those fraud checks will be, you'll see that you have to provide 3 months account statements. And I had one client, pro bono client, actually asking, is that to validate expenses or what? And more of a fraud check, I think, honestly, than anything else, just to make sure the funds are not going to account that was set up, last week, getting one of these grants. And there are other safeguards too. The SBA in back end. I think the panelists could probably speak more to this than I could, just from a technical point of view. But there's they're checking against sort of tax records based on EIN or social security numbers provided, and they're also tying it into SBA's own databases, PPP loans. So, for example, if somebody got a PPP loan and failed to disclose it, whether intentionally or not, I think the hopes that their new system would that before they fund the grant for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund to make sure that that PPP loan was properly into the calculation for the grant. So that's that's sort of the first part of the question, and the second, in terms of is it worth applying? I was kind of disappointed with PPP rollout. It seemed those types of concerns. So one thing is clear: appropriations here is not sufficient for the entire restaurant and hospitality industry. That's definitely clear. So one, we'll see if anything, once the funds are spoken for, to increase appropriations. But even if they don't, smaller operator, and you felt shut out or couldn't do enough for some of the earlier grants, or I've heard from some really small operators, about the kind of local, they feel like they didn't get a fair shot for state level grants, and so they're really skeptical about participating in the program. I do think the set asides from the SBA for the smaller businesses will help address some of those concerns. So even if you see the larger grant recipients are able to apply more quickly, you should know that there are still those set asides, even if you're not in one of those 3 priority funding groups. So I do think it's worth, especially if you've been operating already pre-pandemic, and it's a relatively easy calculation. If you've been operating since 2018 in particular, it shouldn't require a ton of additional work. And I would still encourage people to go ahead and try to apply if they can. And then if there's not enough appropriations, that's an issue for Congress to take up to help make sure there's an equitable approach overall here.
Mm-hmm.
and
Thanks,
to add
Eric.
to that,
yeah, please, Ola.
I mean, Eric said it, it was very well said. I know that the SBA had done a lot of work on the front end with ecosystem partners to explain that there would be validations, fraud checks, and safeguards in place using EIN and tax records to make sure that there wasn't fraudulent activity. They learned from their mistakes in PPP, and were doing the very hard work of trying to get this to be as accurate as possible. And so we did a lot of work with them on that. In terms of kind of taking the square hat off for a second, in terms of funds and availability, I really do urge small businesses and constituencies to put pressure on Congress, because that's honestly where the source is. Congress is going to be the one that's going to authorize these funds, and the SBA will write guidance and rules for implementation. And then maybe others like Touch and Square will help as ecosystem partners or POS providers. But the source of the funds is Congress, at least authorization. So I just always like to put that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially now, certainly action by constituents and in voicing your concerns, needs, etc., is more important than ever. And I think there's a general recognition that the restaurant industry is so critical to the national economy, the state economy, and certainly the fabrics of our communities.
Yeah.
Yes,
Alicia,
please.
Yeah, sorry, just to add on to that, and I apologize if this is kind of piling onto a point already made, but it's important to remember that, although the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, itself, it was part of a larger package in the American Rescue Plan, and obviously that had different, that was not a bipartisan vote. Ultimately, that was a party line vote, and we saw some of that earlier in the pandemic to a lesser extent. With the CARES Act, there was more bipartisan support for that. But once the programs were in place, like once the PPP was in place, and it was clear that the funding was not going to be sufficient or equitable, and you were able to kind of target legislation at that particular program and take it out of the context of discussions around broader administration, and broader congressional or administrative initiatives, so that it's just this one issue. I think you see more bipartisan support to make sure the funding is sufficient and equitably provided in those circumstances. So I'm optimistic that, and maybe this is naive, but that if the funding does dry up too quickly, that the program can be revisited and replenished along the same lines that the PPP was, at least to make sure that every legitimate operator who's eligible gets kind of a fair shot to participate on parity through one round of funding. Because otherwise you're going to have, unfortunately, a situation where the one, again, where the for the most part, where those who are best able to submit their applications the earliest, or provide the cleanest documentation, et cetera, are going to get funded, and others won't. And I know we all know people, whether or not we're directly in the restaurant industry, people running restaurants or bars or food truck, they're working on their business all the time, and they're not always keeping, every last purchase order or every last receipt. They're trying to make their business work. And so if this rolls out in a way where those businesses aren't able to participate for reasons related to documentation or the inability to provide a CPA comfort letter, then I think we're going to, we need to get that feedback to the policymakers, as Ola was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points, Eric. Thank you for that. Final thoughts on the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, the application process. Anything on your mind, Ismini, as we close out our conversation today?
Yeah, really just urging operators to reach out to their accountant, to reach out to their lawyer if they need help, kind of getting a handle on any of their documents related to business ownership, and really just reiterating what Ola and Eric have been saying, which is get your application in as soon as possible. And again, kind of a little bit more on that theme is with RRF, we did get that feedback from customers around, there wasn't a lot of prioritization for independent businesses, for example. And something else we've really been playing up with the RRF is that there is, that from previous rounds, we have learned, and there are benefits to this program. So please do apply. Please gather your documentation in advance so that when you get into that application, you've got everything ready to go and you can submit in 30 minutes or less if everything goes smoothly. So really just reiterating that message to all operators: apply, it's worth it.
Thanks for that. Ola, any parting words for the audience today?
You know, we're hoping that we can get funds quickly or applications through quickly because of the information that we have about your businesses pre 2020, and we think that it'll help you get in that first tier of recipients. We're hoping that Congress will add some more funds, but we don't know if that's the case. So just like everyone and all the panelists have said, you have to apply, and you have to apply now, because their $28.6 billion is not enough for the entire country. And restaurants, again, are vital to our economy. So just get out there and get the information, get the applications through whatever means you can.
Thanks for that. Eric, any parting words for the group today?
Well, first of all, just thank you for making the time for us, audience and panelists, and Alicia and everybody else at GFS. This has been great to be able to talk about this with operators. My only, as a lawyer in the group, I guess I have to say this, is just, again, let's reinforce, make sure you keep, even if you don't do it for all your expenses, keep records of these expenses that you use grant funds, assuming you get your grant funded. If you're eventually gonna have to come back around to SBA to show that you use the funds on eligible expenses in the right time period. So don't lose sight of that. If and when you get funded, make sure you familiarize yourself with kind of the back end process as much as you can in terms of what kind of documents SBA will ultimately require, and then keep those records even after you've submitted them to the SBA. Tuck it away somewhere, because you may get audited. I'm not trying to scare you away from applying. This is just the way government grants work. You just want to keep a good record of that, and be able to sleep well at night knowing that you've got the backup should that audit or review ever come.
Great advice, Eric. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists today. This was a great discussion. Again, thank you to Back of House for sponsoring this. And on behalf of Gordon Food Service, we want to let you know that we are with you. We are excited for better days ahead. And we will support you through this with webinars like this and others going forward. So have a wonderful day. Good luck, and take care.